Hello. Welcome to another Bible study. Today we're going to be diving into Genesis chapter 37. This marks the final chunk in Genesis. The next 14 chapters all deal with Joseph. Joseph is one of my favorite characters in the Bible. Peter I really like because I can relate to him a lot. Joseph I love because he is a great example of how we as Christians ought to live our lives. As we watch what happens to Joseph, no matter how hard the situation gets, he's always faithful to God, and he always makes the best of whatever situation he's in. And I love him for that, and we're going to study more on that. So today we're looking at Genesis 37, and it's the story of Joseph, who is Jacob's second youngest son, in which he is sold into slavery by his brothers. Next week, we'll hit Genesis 38, which is a tangent talking about Judah. Then we'll pick it up, Genesis 39 the following week, in which we'll look at Joseph and Potiphar's wife, another great story, an example for how we ought to live. So why don't you bow your heads and let's dig into this and learn more about the story of Joseph through Genesis chapter 37. Lord, thank you. Thank you for this time. Thank you for the means that we have to be able to do this, the time that we have to be able to take and study your word. I pray that you will speak to us, that you'll speak through me, that these will be your words, not mine, and that we'll learn more about you and your character through studying your word. We dedicate this time to you, and we love you. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to be reading, I'm going to break this up into two chunks. We're going to hit the first 11 verses, and then we'll pause and talk about those, and then we'll hit the following verses 12 through 36, and then talk about those. So why don't you join me, Genesis 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word of him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, let's break this apart. So the first thing that I encountered in going through and just looking at all these different elements that jumped out to me, verse 2, this is the account of Jacob's family line. I noticed that we see that a lot in Genesis, and I haven't said anything about it until now, but this is the account of. This is the account of Isaac. This is the account of Jacob. This is the account of Noah and his family. So the word is actually Toledoth is how you pronounce it in Hebrew. It's spelled Toldot, and it's either account in the NIV. King James has it as the descendants or the lineage, so to speak. But there are 10 times in Genesis when this word is used, and it actually breaks up Genesis into 10 chunks. The first time it's used is in Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 5:1, this is the account of Adam. Genesis 6:9, this is the account of Noah and his family. 11:27, this is the account of Abraham through Terah. Genesis 25:19, this is the account of Isaac. And then here, Genesis 37:2, this is the account of Jacob through Joseph. So as I mentioned at the intro, this is our final chunk, and it'll take us through the next 14 next 14 chapters, as we look at the account, the lineage, the descendants of Jacob, specifically through Joseph. Okay, so this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now, as you recall, Jacob had 4 wives. He had Leah, and he had Rachel, who were his... Rachel was the one that he fell in love with. He was enthralled with her, and he wanted to marry her. But Rachel's father swindled Jacob. The swindler got swindled, and Jacob ended up marrying Leah and had to work an additional 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. Well, in the process of marrying those two, they each had handmaidens who were Bilhah and Zilpah. So that's where you get the 4 wives. What ended up happening is that in a series of years in which Leah and Rachel were both having kids, they both reached a point at which they weren't able to produce children, and it was the custom of the time that we've talked about to continue the family line. If you, as the woman, was not able to bear children, your handmaiden, your servant, you would give to your husband so that the family line could continue. We saw this with Sarah and Hagar. Sarah wasn't able to conceive, and so with the custom of the day, she gave Abraham her handmaiden Hagar. Now, that was a separate subject, and the question is, did Abraham seek the Lord before he said, okay, and married Hagar? We don't know that. But we do know in looking at Isaac that there were 4 wives, and from those 4 wives, you have 12 sons. So just as a refresher for these 12 sons, I'm going to break them up based on their mother. So Leah had the first sons. Reuben is the eldest of the 12. He actually lost his birthright. The birthright was that inheritance. The leader of the family got a double portion in the wealth, but also had the responsibility of carrying on the family name and the family line. Genesis 35:22 is an interesting one-line verse in which it says that Reuben slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. Now, we talked about that when we went through Genesis 35. That was actually last week when we hit 35 and 36. And there's a few different reasons why scholars believe that happened, or why would Reuben have done that, and I'm not going to get into that. But at any rate, we know from Genesis 49, Jacob gives his final blessing, the patriarchal blessing, which wasn't always a good thing. It was a final pronouncement of what they believed to be their destiny, their future. And in that, Jacob says in 49:3 and 4, he removes the final birthright blessing from Reuben because of what he did in that situation. So then the next 2 sons are Simeon and Levi. They lose their birthright because what they did in Genesis 34. As you recall that story, that's the story of Shechem, in which Prince Shechem raped their sister Dinah, Jacob's daughter Dinah, and in retaliation, Simeon and Levi have a scheme, and they end up killing all of the Shechemites, all the males in Shechem's household, and in result of that, they lose their birthright, and that is also given by Jacob in chapter 49, verse 5 and 7. So then continuing on, you have Judah, Ishkar, Zebulun. Those are the 6 sons born to Leah. Then you have Bilhah, who was Rachel's handmaiden, who you have Dan and Naphtali. Then you have Zilpah, who was Leah's handmaiden, who had Gad and Asher. And then you have Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite. And you have Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin is the youngest, and Rachel actually died giving birth to Benjamin. So that's the 12 brothers. Now, in this, it says that Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now, those 4 individuals were Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. We do not know if the other brothers were there or not, but he specifically, the author names Bilhah and Zilpah, so we know those 4 were there in that situation, in that specific verse. So Joseph was the favorite. When you look at Joseph, I love the guy because of his optimism, but at the same time, he was a young, cocky 17-year-old kid, and the dreams that he has, the way that he told his brothers about these dreams, you can just picture him being this bubbly guy. Hey guys, I had a dream. Guess what I dreamed? It's amazing. You guys are all going to bow down to me. And that's how I picture it, is that he was very cocky and just didn't even realize how arrogant he was. He was Dad's favorite. And we see in verse 3 of chapter 37 that Jacob gave Joseph an ornate robe. Here are some photos that Hollywood's portrayal of the robe. Joseph in his Technicolor dream coat. So these are some of the adaptations that they have of what he might have looked like. This is a screenshot of the movie Joseph, King of Dreams, and you can see the robe that he's wearing there. This is a great movie. This is done, it's DreamWorks. It's done by the same crew that did Prince of Egypt. Ben Affleck is actually the voice of Joseph, and Mark Hamill is actually the voice of Judah. Luke Skywalker is the voice of Judah in that movie. So it's a good movie, not 100% accurate, but pretty good. It's a great one for kids. But at any rate, so what was this robe, and what did it signify? The robe, the word is actually pas, P-A-S, is the Hebrew word, and the commentaries that I read say we don't really know exactly what it meant. The word is used 5 times in the Bible. 3 of those are in Genesis 37, talking about this coat, this robe. The other 2 are in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 18 and 19. All 5 instances describe a garment of some sort. My NIV says ornate robe. If you have a King James, it says coat of many colors. We really don't know what it actually looked like, other than they believe the Blue Letter Bible app defined it as a long-sleeved tunic reaching to the palms and to the sole of the feet. So it's a very large robe. We do know that it did signify status and favor, simply because of the connotations of how it was used in the 5 instances. So at any rate, Jacob, his favorite son, is Joseph, and he gives him this robe to make it clear to everybody, including the other 11 brothers, this is my favorite son. So you can understand why the other brothers hated him, absolutely hated him. So then we get into these dreams, and as the movie Joseph, King of Dreams points out, we see a lot of dreams in Genesis 37 all the way through 41. We see 2 dreams here in 37. We have the dream of the sheaves of grain bowing down. Then we have the dream of the sun, moon, and 11 stars all bowing down. In Genesis 40, we are going to see Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker both have dreams, and Joseph is in prison with them, and he's going to interpret those dreams. Then in Genesis 41, Pharaoh is going to have a dream, and that is also going to be interpreted by Joseph with God's assistance in all of these. He interprets the dreams. We see dreams throughout the Bible. Daniel is another very similar story with King Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel is, through God, given the power to interpret King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. That's in Daniel chapter 2. So this first dream, let's talk about the 2 dreams. The first dream you have these sheaves of grain, which it's obvious interpretation. There's 11 of them. Joseph's sheaf of grain rises up, and the other 11 bow down to his. Interpretation is very easy to see that the significance here, that the brothers clearly respond in seeing it this way, that they will bow down to him. This does happen, and we will see this dream fulfilled in Genesis 42:6. You can read ahead if you want to hear the story, but it does come to pass that Joseph's brothers all do bow down to him, and we see that in Genesis 42:6. The second dream, on verse 9, we see the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. So in the first dream, it's the sheaf of grain bows down to his sheaf of grain. But in this one, it's the sun and moon and stars actually bow down to Joseph, which is just a little bit different in that it's not Joseph as a star, it's just straight up Joseph. The other thing that is unique is that you have the sun and moon. So with this, there is this question of why is the sun and moon there? The obvious thing that jumps out is it obvious to me implies mom and dad, and I think that's the easiest interpretation. And you see the way that Jacob responds to this is saying that what, your mother and I are going to bow down to you and serve you. Genesis 26:4 is part of the Abrahamic covenant, and God says, "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky." So the stars are really significant in that this dream implies that, sorry, for those that are watching, you can see this is Lily, and when I study the Bible, this is often what she does, is she is sitting on top of my Bible, reading scripture. She's adorable. Sorry. So this second dream and the stars is hugely significant because what it shows is the significance of the ancestral line. Not only the brothers, but Jacob himself, Israel, is going to bow down to Joseph. It is through Joseph and what is going to happen in Egypt that the entire line, the Jews, are saved from the famine, and they become a mighty people in Egypt. They do eventually, Pharaoh does enslave them, and that's the whole story of Exodus. But through Joseph, the people are saved. The entire region is saved, Northern Africa and the Middle East, because of God's working through Joseph. But an interesting question. So you see the sun and the moon, right? But Joseph's mom died, Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. So this is after that. So who is the moon in this situation? The sun is likely father and the moon is likely mother. So there's two different theories that I found. One is a symbolic element of it being Rachel, symbolically of being mother and father bowing down. The other theory that was stipulated that I found is that it's in reference to Bilhah. Bilhah was Joseph and Benjamin's surrogate mother, that when Rachel died, Bilhah no doubt took care of them. So it very well could be that is who the moon is referencing. Don't know. So now let's read the remainder of Genesis 37, starting on verse 12. I'm sorry, Kat, but I need to get to my Bible. Excuse me. Pardon me. Thank you. Sorry, Kat. Okay, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived in Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached him, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay. So first of all, we travel from Hebron to Shechem. Here is a map that I found online. And as you look at this, you can see Hebron, which is due west of the Dead Sea. And as you go north, slightly east, you cross through Bethlehem, Jerusalem. As you keep going north, you hit Shechem. Shechem is the location of the story in Genesis 34 with the Shechemites and Dinah and what happened there. So he arrives there, and then there's this weird two lines, verse 15 and 7 through 17, where he's wandering in a field, and this random guy sees him and asks, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for my brothers." And they said, "They've gone north of here to Dothan." So whenever I'm studying the Bible, I read through at first glance, and I just read through the whole thing. I read through the whole chapter and just highlight anything that jumps out to me. Then I pray on it, I think about it, meditate on it, as what is jumping out to me, what is odd, what do I need to know more information on. Then I dig up the commentaries and I see what other scholars have said about this. Then I'll put my notes in, and then I will come back to it and ask, application, what does this mean for me today? And that's the similar process that we go through, is that we read it and then we go in and break it up and take a look at it. So in looking at this was one passage that really jumped out to me as, why is this even here? What does this even matter? I mean, Joseph arrived in Shechem, didn't find his brothers, and he continues on to Dothan. Like, it could have just simply said that he went on to Dothan and found his brothers, and as he was walking in, they saw him and they said, "Hey, let's kill the dreamer." But there's these few lines that are here. Every word that's in the Bible is there for a reason. And the commentary that I found it very interesting. One of the things that one of the commentators, Walton, in this one, the NIV application commentary, listed a bunch of different theories as far as why it's there. One of the theories, two of the main ones were literary transition. simply to transition from him wandering to seeking. Then suspense builder is another theory that's out there, that it's building the suspense that he can't find his brothers and it's just making for a better story. Another theory is that it's just incidental, that it's just simply a thing that happened that was included in there. But as I said, everything has a reason for being there. And Walton actually proposes a theory this could be a theophany. A theophany, as we've talked about, is where God steps into the story, where God appears and interacts with man. Now, it could be an angel, it could be God, it could be Christophany, in which it's Jesus in the flesh. We don't know, and this is just a theory, but think about this for a second. Joseph is wandering around looking for his brothers. Now, Dothan is between 10 and 13 miles north, so he's way off. He's way off. He has no idea where his brothers are. That was the last spot that they were seen. If he doesn't find them in Shechem, he's not going to randomly go 13 miles north and find them. If he doesn't find them, he'll return south. So what happens in that situation? What happens if he returns south? If he returns south, this story doesn't continue. He doesn't get sold into slavery. He doesn't go down into Egypt. God intervened in this story to make sure that his narrative was achieved. The goal of protecting the Abrahamic covenant and protecting the progression of Israel. And also, God had plans for Joseph down in Egypt. So while this is just a theory, I think it's a pretty solid one, that this small little interaction here could have been God stepping in. Now, maybe it was just a farmer and God pushed him just a little bit and inspired him to go out into the field and talk to the young guy with the really bright jumpsuit, the really bright coat. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here." The man answered, "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" He overheard them say, "Let's go to Dothan." It's just a theory, but I think it can hold water. That's God intervening to make sure that Joseph finds his brothers and the storyline continues. Interesting stuff. Okay, so then we have a cistern, right? So the brothers see him coming. And Reuben protects him at first and says, let's not kill him. Let's throw him into this cistern. He is our blood, after all. We don't want to kill him. Now, we don't know. This is verse 21 and 22. We don't know what Reuben's motives are here. Could it be that Reuben is trying to get back in his father's good graces and he knows that Joseph is his favorite? That very well could be. It very well could be that all of his motivation is to try to get back in good graces with his father and to retain his ancestral birthright as being the eldest son. It's very plausible that was his motivation, or he could just be trying to do the right thing. Don't know. But we see cistern mentioned it's first mentioned in verse 20, and then it's mentioned several other times. So let's look up the definition. So we're going to read from the New International Bible Dictionary for what is a cistern. Cistern, an artificial tank or reservoir dug in the earth or rock for the collection of storage of rainwater or sometimes of spring water brought from a distance by a conduit. Cisterns were very numerous in Palestine, the long, dry, rainless summers lasting from May to September, and the small annual precipitation together with a lack of natural springs made the people largely dependent on rainwater. Cisterns in Palestine varied in size and character. Some were cut wholly in the rock, often in the form of a bottle-shaped tank with a long stairway leading to the surface of the ground. The temple area in Jerusalem had at least 37 great cisterns, one of them holding between 2 and 3 million gallons. You get the idea. It's a really, really, really big pit that Joseph is not able to get out of, that they had to lower down a ladder to be able to put him in it and to get him out. So that's the cistern. So now we have verse 25 through 28. caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites. Who are the Ishmaelites and Midianites? Well, if you've been reading and traveling along with us as we've been going through Genesis, these are both descendants of Abraham. As I've mentioned, Abraham and Sarah, it was Abram and Sarai. Their names were changed to Abraham and Sarah by God. But God gives this blessing that I'm going to make a great and mighty nation from you. The stars as numerous as the sky, the sand as numerous as the sand, etc. And they get impatient. And Sarah comes up with this idea that because I am not able to conceive, have children through my handmaid, marry Hagar, and through that, Ishmael is born. Then God steps in and says, Sarah will have a son, and that's where Isaac comes in. But then after Sarah dies, Abraham marries again and marries Keturah. And it's from Keturah that he has more sons as well. So you have Ishmael, you have Isaac, and there's 4 or 5 additional sons from Keturah. Well, the Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael through Hagar, with Abraham as their patriarch, and the Midianites are descendants through Keturah with Abraham as their patriarch as well. So these are distant relatives, likely second or third cousins, that are traveling. They are merchants traveling from Gilead to Egypt. Gilead is east of the Jordan River. This is a map that I found, is the travel route that the merchants would have taken. Gilead would be east of Dothan there. They would have traveled through Dothan and down through Gaza all the way to Egypt. So these guys were traveling down to sell their goods. The goods they had with them were spices, balm, and myrrh. Spices are self-understanding. They were spices. Balm is a salve, a lotion, so to speak, that you'd put on your body. Myrrh was a spice extracted from a tree used for embalming, but it was also a spice that was mixed for wine for pain relief. And in Mark 15:23, you can read that for yourself. Mark 15:23, Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh when he is up on the cross. So you have these merchants, Ishmaelites, Midianites that are traveling down to Egypt, and it is actually not Reuben, but Judah who steps in and says, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother and our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Now, we don't know what Judah's motivation was. Was he trying to actually save his brother's life because he loved him and he wanted to protect him as his brother? Or was he looking to literally gain an extra shekel of silver? Was he swindling? Was he conniving? Was he trying to figure out, well, what good does it do us to kill him and to have to bury the body, etc., and deal with that and get our hands dirty with his blood? No, let's just sell him and make some money. We don't know what his motivation was, but because of this, Joseph is sold as a slave, but his life is spared. And because of this, he goes down to Egypt. Now we know in 37:28 that he's sold for 20 shekels of silver. In my research, I found that 20 shekels of silver was the going rate for a slave. It was a standard rate. 20 shekels of silver was what you were given for a slave, and that's what they got. I did read that a shekel of silver was the equivalent of 1 day's wages, a working man's wage, so to speak. So I did some basic math, and assuming $15 an hour for a working man's or person's wage, at $15 an hour, 8 hours a day, it's $120. So based on that simple math, 1 shekel would be worth $120. Multiply that by 20, and you get $2,400. Joseph, in this very simple math, was sold for $2,400. Divide that 10 ways, because we know Benjamin was not part of this. Benjamin is Joseph's only full-blood brother, his only other brother by Rachel. He was home with dad. And we know that Joseph obviously isn't going to get any money out of this, so it's split 10 ways. So $240 was their plunder, their great wealth that they gained for selling their brother into slavery. Okay, let's continue on. So then we see the brothers now need to cover up their trail. They need to come up with a story. Their dad's favorite son has been killed is the story, but they got to figure out what they're going to do. So they slaughter a goat and they take the ornate robe, dip it in the blood, and bring it back to dad and say, hey, we found this. Isn't this Joseph's? Isn't this your son's? And it's Jacob who comes to the conclusion that he's been killed by a wild beast and that he's dead. And that's where he tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and goes into mourning. So let's talk about that. Tore his clothes, 37, 29, and 34. Verse 29 and verse 34. In 29, we actually see Reuben tear his clothes. And then in 34, we see Jacob tear his clothes. Verse 29 is the first instance in the Bible of seeing this tearing of clothes. It was a common practice for Jews in instances of extreme pain, sorrow, grief, frustration, or anger. A few other references, if you want to dig deeper for yourself. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, we see King David tear his clothes when Saul and Jonathan were killed. Job 120, after hearing that his sons and daughters were all killed, in one instance, one conversation, one sitting, he finds out that all of his children have died. He tears his clothes. Acts 14:14, Paul and Barnabas are out on their missionary journeys and are in Lystra, and the people of Lystra start worshiping Paul and Barnabas as gods. It's from that Paul and Barnabas rip their clothes and tell them to stop. Worship God alone. He alone is worthy to be worshiped. Don't worship us. We are simply the messengers. Then Matthew 26, 62 through 65. Actually, let's flip there. So leave a marker here in Genesis 37 and flip with me to Matthew. Matthew 26. I'll give you a second to get there. Matthew 26. Picking up halfway through verse 63. The high priest said to him, this is to Jesus, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. This is at the trial before Jesus' crucifixion. Among the Pharisees, one thing that I did find and read is that it was a law, it was a requirement of the Pharisees that anytime you heard blasphemy, you were required to tear your clothes. So this tearing of the clothes it's not something that we see today from a cultural standpoint and from a practical standpoint. From a practical standpoint, I could try to rip this and I probably could get away with it. It's pretty good cloth. And I would probably end up just stretching the seam out. But the clothes that they had were all handmade. They weren't made by machines. They weren't tight knit. It's much more difficult. I imagine that with those clothes, it was a lot easier just to tear them. It was also, in my mind, if you think about it, the value. They didn't have the wardrobes that we have. They didn't have Walmart on the corner to go get clothes. They had to all have been made by hand. So it was hugely significant to tear your clothes. It was a very symbolic outward gesture of pain, of frustration, of anger. And we see it several times. And those instances that I gave are not by any means all the exhaustive examples of tearing of clothes. So then you see sackcloth. Sackcloth, burlap is another word for sackcloth. It's very itchy, very rugged sackcloth. And we see Jacob when he finds out that his son Joseph has been killed by a wild beast. He tears his clothes and he puts on sackcloth. It's burlap. It's very itchy fabric. The idea is that he is in mourning. He doesn't want to be comfortable. He wants to have that itchy discomfort on him as he mourns for the loss of his son. And then the final verse of 37, we see, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And that will close our study for today. We'll pick it up with Joseph, not next week, but the following week. Next week, we have a little pause as we hit Genesis 38 and we look at Judah. And this story actually, from a timeline standpoint, bridges the gap. It actually covers a big chunk of time while Joseph is down in Egypt. It's a tough story, Genesis 38. I recommend that you read it, read ahead. It doesn't paint a good picture for Judah necessarily. But as we wrap this up, let's talk about application. Let's talk about takeaways. And my homework for you, whether on your own, in your small group discussions with your spouse, try to put yourself in the shoes of the different characters in this story. The logical one and easy one to put yourself in the shoes of is Joseph. But I would ask you to first put yourself in the shoes of the non-favored brothers, right? So not even the ones born to Leah or Rachel, but to the other four that were born to the handmaids, to Zilpah or Bilhah, to Dan, Gad, Asher, or I think Manasseh is the fourth one. Think about the story from their point of view. Think about that, meditate on that, and pray on that. Read this chapter from their perspective of this annoying favorite child and this opportunity to get rid of him seamlessly and not get caught. And can you relate to that? If you weren't going to get caught, what would you potentially do? If you were convinced that you wouldn't get caught, the temptations are there for a lot of different things. I think we can all relate to these brothers. Then, there is putting yourself in Joseph's shoes, but before that, put yourself in God's shoes just for a minute. I know that's just try to think from the heavenly perspective, right? You love Joseph. You love all of Jacob's sons. You don't want to see Joseph go through pain, but at the same time, you know that Joseph has to go down to Egypt. You know that in this situation, it will be horrible for him for years, that he's going to go through this trial. He's going to go through this really, really tough time. But because of that, Israel as a people group will be saved in the years of famine that are coming up. And the people of Egypt will be saved. And all of Israel will end up flourishing down in Egypt. Now, eventually, as I mentioned, we do get into the story of Exodus, when the Pharaoh does, the Egyptians grew too many. Excuse me, not the Egyptians. The Israelites grew too many, and they were enslaved. That takes us on to the next story of Exodus. But the point being is that Jeremiah 29:11, right? Look that up. Jeremiah 29:11. You don't have to flip there now. God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And yet, you see God's hand ensure that this happens, that out of this sinful act from the brothers, God's grace abounds, and he does amazing good through bad. The third person and final one to put yourself in the shoes of is obviously Joseph, right? He's the favorite. I'm the youngest in my family, and I can see I was a cocky young kid. Some would say I still am. The point being is that I can relate to Joseph. And there's times when I was young and arrogant and cocky that I said some really stupid things and didn't think about how others might see them. But think about Joseph's perspective. In this verse, Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future." What was going through Joseph's mind when he was at the bottom of the cistern and he heard his brothers talking about the fact that they were going to kill him? And then when he found out he wasn't going to be killed, but he was going to be sold to Ishmaelites and taken down to Egypt. Imagine Joseph's perspective on life as he is in chains walking the many, many, many miles, the great distance from Canaan all the way down to Egypt. Do you think he was thinking, oh, the Lord has great plans for me, plans to prosper me and not to harm me? But as I said at the beginning, Joseph is such an optimist. We're going to see him be the best servant he can possibly be. We'll pick that up in Genesis 39. When he takes the challenge that God has given him and he makes the best of it. Whatever you do, work as if you're working for the Lord, not for human hands, but you're doing it for God. So as you put yourself in these different perspectives, in the perspective of the brothers, in God's perspective, and then in Joseph's perspective, reflect on these and reflect back on what does that mean and how can you apply that in your life, right? If you're really angry at somebody, as the brothers were, and you're going to take retaliation on them, well, what does the Bible say that you should do in that situation? I'm not saying to use an example and take that person and sell them into slavery. That's not what I'm saying. Then also think about it from the perspective of God's perspective, that the greater good is going to be met, but Joseph has to go through hardship. So then for us and our personal takeaway, what hardship are you facing that might be very well making you stronger? And through that hardship, you're going to end up flourishing if you take Joseph's perspective of it and you don't wallow in your pity, but you say, okay, God, this is the hand I've been dealt right now, and you have plans of good for me, plans not to harm me, plans of hope and a future that you have for me. So I'm going to take this situation that I'm in right now, and I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to do the very best that I can with it, and I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for this situation, because it is the Lord's that those the Lord loves, he disciplines. So whatever the situation that you're in, try to think about how awful Joseph's perspective would have been and how you can relate to that in your own life. Lord, thank you. Thank you that you've given us your word. Thank you that we can read about Joseph and the life that he led. Thank you that you protected him, that even in that situation when he was down in the bottom of the cistern, you gave him hope and you protected him because you had a plan for him. Thank you that we can look at Joseph and use him as an example. Lord, we love you. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Awesome, guys. Have a phenomenal week. And next week, we will pick it up. Hi, Lily. Next week, we will pick it up with Genesis 38 and the story of Judah and some bad decisions that he makes. Hi, kitty cat. You want to say hi to the camera? This is Lily Kitty. Hi, Lily Kitty. She's so annoyed with me. Have a good week, guys.